Britain is already coming under a withering attack from the likes of Vice President JD Vance and also Elon Musk. I mean, do you share their view that there's a free speech crisis in the UK?
I was outraged by Elon Musk's recent comments at the Tommy Robinson demonstration in London, and I was outraged, but I was for two reasons. One, because it is absolutely not acceptable for Elon Musk to try and interfere in British democracy, calling essentially for the overthrow of an elected government, but also because of the way that he talked about our country. I think we're an amazing country, and every country in the world has challenges. But when I look across all of the sectors that I represent as the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, whether it's film, TV, music, fashion, broadcasted news, the BBC World Service, like I said, a light on the hill for people all over the world. When I look across the board, we are brilliant at this.
Well,
And
okay.
there is a real challenge in Britain about how to open up those opportunities to more people. But the characterisation of our country was just wrong. Now, I actually think this has I think this has I think this provokes a back this sort of behaviour provokes a backlash, because I think most people are proud of our country and of our traditions, including free speech and, the right to have healthy debate and disagreement. And I don't think they recognise the country that Elon Musk was describing.
Well,
But
let's
I do
leave
think
that.
it's a dangerous thing when you have very, very wealthy people trying to interfere in democracy, and I think we should resist it.
Yeah, well, leave Elon Musk. Let's call him an outlier. What about Vice President JD Vance, who's been consistent in his criticism of what he thinks are restrictions on free speech?
Well, I don't think we have restrictions on free speech here in the UK, and I think we should be very proud of that. But I do think that there are too many people who aren't heard. I don't think those people are tech billionaires. I think the people who aren't heard are too often the people that I represent here in Wigan, and people like them around the country. And that, going back to the importance of the BBC and other public service media, that is why we've got to make sure that the ecosystem that we've got supports them and enables them to be seen and heard, because they are the people giving voice to the whole country.
Lisa, you mentioned the Online Safety Act, and that sort of dovetails with this issue because we've just seen enormous tech deals with US companies being announced. And some people feel we're now handing over the keys to our communications to the regulatory system from America. So, for instance, the Online Safety Act includes wide-ranging powers and fines and sanctions against US tech companies or any tech company that infringes it. But at the same time, you've got Donald Trump saying, you dare lay a finger on any of our tech companies, and we'll hit you with swingeing tariffs or export restrictions. So how can Britain have its own regulatory system in the online world where you've got Trump saying, you do anything against my companies and I will retaliate?
I think a couple of things. The first is you could see this week from the state visit that there are areas on which we strongly disagree with the United States and with the current administration, but where we can have those disagreements and continue to work together in our shared national interest. I haven't met President Trump, but when we were in opposition, when I was serving as shadow foreign secretary, I did meet with their then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo with Keir. And one of the things that really struck me about the Trump administration is that how many of them are drawn from a business background, not a political background. And so much of the conversation that we had, and I think the Prime Minister will have been having this week, it was about doing deals. And um, President Trump has signalled many, many times that he likes to do deals that are in America's national interest. But if he can do a deal that is in both the British and American national interest, then he's very happy to do that. So I think you can see there's a different approach from the Trump administration to, I think, perhaps any elected government that I've worked with over the last 15 years in Parliament. And they are very comfortable with disagreeing on issues whilst also doing deals that are in our shared national interest. I think the second thing that I would say is that those comments about, you know, the expressed desire from President Trump for us not to penalise American tech companies. He made those he's expressed those views many times over the years, but Parliament decided to pass the Online Safety Act anyway, and that is because regulating what our citizens and our children see and hear, making sure that it's both high quality and not harmful, that it acts as a tool of social cohesion, not a tool that breaks us apart. That is important to us as a government. It's been important to successive governments, and it's important to Parliament. And so we've passed that legislation, we've set up our own rules and our own framework, and we intend to enforce it. And that is too important to be beholden to anything else. That is an absolute core of British democracy, and we'll continue to take that approach.
Lisa, I'm sure you were watching the scenes at Windsor as closely as I was, and this 2-day state visit, and it had a sort of surreal quality because, you know, we had the British at their best with their pageantry and their flattery and the deal making. But back in America, a top TV host was abruptly taken off the air when the federal regulator said you can either do this nicely or nasty because he said what were considered to be inappropriate remarks about the killer of Charlie Kirk, the activist, conservative activist. And meanwhile, the president, as lawyers have taken out a $15 billion lawsuit against the New York Times. I mean, people are writing and talking about a new era of censorship in America. Do you think that's right? And is that coming soon over here?
Um, I mean, I watched the developments in the United States, and I don't think it's, having just heavily criticised Elon Musk for, characterising and opining about Britain. I think it would be wrong of me to do the same about America. I think though the debate that is being had in America, it's perhaps more, more polarised than it is here in the UK, but still the same issues are preoccupying us here in the UK, and for good reason. There's, many of the things that have come across my desk since I was appointed to this job just over a year ago have been in precisely this space where you've got people who are offended by some of the things that they see and hear, and that offence can spill over into harm, and then it raises really serious questions about who and what can be heard, the role of government in that, and I think it's a really difficult area to get right. I was thinking back just as you were asking me this too. My dad was very involved in race relations all his life, and he ended up working for Roy Jenkins when he was Home Secretary, framing the Race Relations Act and some of the equalities legislation that came out of that era. And that, these debates aren't new, that the architects of that legislation had to grapple with the right of people to make their own decisions in society, to disagree with one another, to say things that might be quite hurtful and quite offensive to other people, versus the right of people not to have to put up with that as a daily drumbeat to their lives. And so I think this is a debate that is important for us to have, and it's not just for government. But the two factors that I have very live in my mind are the right of people to go about their lives as equal citizens, to be heard and to participate in debate without being hounded out of debate because of who they are or what they believe, and the right of free speech and of a free and fair media, of governments not being able to determine what is said, what is heard, who is heard. And in every case, you have to look really closely at that and try and strike
Well, let me
the
let me
right balance.
let me just come back on you on this because I'm as a somebody who's lived in America for 12 years. and watched worked in American media. I mean, this is an unprecedented assault against the TV, uh, newspapers from the administration, and President Trump has made that very clear, even on the plane back across the Atlantic. So doesn't it stick in your craw, or the government's craw, that here you have leading members of the administration saying that Britain has a real crisis on free speech, and meanwhile anybody who criticizes the Trump administration or the president in America faces serious sanction? Isn't this
What I'm
really
interested
double
in is
standards?
no, I mean, what I'm interested in is trying to solve the problem here in the UK, and I think we have got a problem, but I don't think it's quite as straightforward as just free speech and censorship, because I think actually the UK is a very broad, diverse country with lots of different outlets and media, and lots of different voices are heard. But I do think the national conversation is too often not relevant to a lot of people and excludes most people. And I think what that is doing is fueling a polarization where people are increasingly we're sort of retreating into looking at very different sources for our news and our information, and where those sources are not neutral, are not truthful, then we've got a problem.
Okay, can I just go closer to home then, and just go back to that episode, that, or not episode, but a serious event 10 years ago, Brexit, uh, where you could say, and you know where the Financial Times stood and the Guardian stood on Brexit, but do you think that the mainstream media, including the BBC, including maybe the Financial Times, just missed the story, missed the way large sections of the British public were actually alienated from the EU? So we actually dropped the ball. What do you think about that?
I feel like every conversation you and I have, Lionel, whichever decade we're in, ends up back at Brexit somehow. But I do agree with that. And I think I've said that very forcefully before. But I think it's worse than that, because I think we're still missing it. If you look at the coverage of what happened in London over the weekend with 150,000 people turning up in London, and marching alongside somebody who is a convicted criminal and a racist. I think there are large sections of the media who still don't understand what is happening there and are mischaracterizing people. I had constituents who went on that demonstration who aren't, 10 years ago, they would never, it's my judgment that they would not have gone to a march that involved Tommy Robinson. They don't like violence against the police. They don't like racism. They don't believe in conspiracy theories. But more and more, we're seeing people, a sort of outer core of people, being drawn to these movements and these moments. We saw it in the disorder last summer as well. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that happening? I think the answer is that for far too long, too many people have been written off. Their contribution is not seen or valued. They have increasingly less ability to influence the future of their own communities and their country. They don't see themselves reflected in the story we tell ourselves about ourselves as a nation, and they genuinely believe that the future for their children is going to be worse than the lives that they've had. And it's been a long time coming, but that is the situation that our government inherited. And there's lots of ways to deal with that, including what we've done as a government, which is to make it an absolute priority to make the economy work for everybody, not just for some people in our country. But there is also the issues that we're discussing here, which is people have got to see themselves reflected in the story we tell ourselves about ourselves as a nation. My dad was an immigrant to this country in the 1950s, and one of the things that he was involved with was the Annan Commission that was set up on the future of broadcasting several decades ago, which led to Channel 4 being founded. And the reason that he was on that committee was because there was a recognition that the nation was changing. You'd had newly arrived immigrants who'd become part of British life. You had, much more, women in the workplace and demanding to be heard. You'd had opportunities for working class kids that meant that, people like my stepdad, first in his family to stay on at school beyond 11, got the opportunity through grammar school to then go on to university and wanted to be heard in society. And there was a recognition that the broadcast media that we had just wasn't reflecting the full range of the country, and something needed to change. I think we need something like an Annan Commission for modern times, because I think more and more too many people in this country just feel that they're excluded from our national conversation, and that's got to change.
This interview was from the latest episode of Media Confidential, a podcast brought to you by Prospect Magazine. To listen to the full episode, click on the link below. And if you want full access to Prospect Magazine, go to prospectmagazine.co.uk.